That day in the kitchen was one of the craziest, but most exciting moments of my life, thanks to my stepsister Julia. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, and the house was quiet, eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. I had been home alone for most of the day, mindlessly flipping through channels on the TV, trying to pass the time. My dad and his wife Louise were out for the day, running errands, or doing whatever it was they did when they disappeared. Together, that left me and CLA alone in the house. CLA and I had never been particularly close. We were pretty much the same age, but we were polar opposites in nearly every way. She was always the organized, meticulous one, the kind of girl who had a plan for everything. I was the laid-back, easygoing type, content to go with the flow. Our relationship had always been cordial, but distant. We lived under the same roof, exchanging polite greetings. But that was the extent of it. But lately something had shifted over the last few weeks. I had noticed Julia looking at me differently. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the way her eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long, the way she seemed to find excuses to be near me in the same room, sitting just a little too close. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing anyone else would notice, but I felt it. It was subtle. But it was there, and it was starting to drive me crazy. That afternoon, I was sitting in the kitchen scrolling through my phone. As the sun streamed through the windows, I was trying to ignore the strange energy that seemed to hang in the air whenever CLA was around. She had been in her room all day, or so I thought. But when I heard footsteps behind me, I knew she was about to make her presence known. "Hey!" Julia's voice broke the silence as she stepped into the kitchen. I looked up from my phone and saw her standing in the doorway. Her arms crossed over her chest. She looked relaxed, but there was something in her eyes, something that made my heart race a little faster. "Hey," I replied casually, trying to play it cool. "What's up?" She shrugged, walking further into the kitchen, her gaze never leaving mine. Not much, just felt like coming downstairs. "It's pretty quiet. In here." "Here." I nodded, setting my phone down on the table. "Yeah, it is, Louise, and Dad won't be back for a while." Julia glanced at the clock, then back at me, a small smile playing on her lips. "I know, that's why I came down." I felt my stomach tighten. At her words, though, I wasn't entirely sure why. There was something different about the way she was looking at me, something playful, yet serious. At the same time, it made me uneasy, but also so intrigued. Julia walked over to the stove, grabbing a glass from the cabinet before filling it with water. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if she knew I was watching her. And I was. I couldn't help it. There was something about the way she moved, the way her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, the way her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It made it hard to look away. "What are you doing in here all alone?" she asked, taking a sip from her glass before leaning against the counter. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just bored, I guess. Killing time until they get back." She nodded, her eyes still locked on mine. "You've been acting weird lately." The comment caught me off guard, and I frowned slightly. "Weird? What do you mean?" Julia tilted her head, her smile widening just a fraction. "Don't know you've been avoiding me." I blinked, surprised by her observation. I hadn't thought I was avoiding her, but maybe I had been. It wasn't intentional. But the tension between us, whatever it was, had been growing, and I didn't know how to handle it. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though. My voice lacked conviction. She raised an eyebrow, setting her glass down on the counter. "Really, because it feels like you are." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I had been keeping my distance from CLA. I didn't know why exactly, but it was like something had changed between us, and I didn't know how to navigate it. I didn't know if it was just me, or if she felt it too. But either way, I had been trying to ignore her. I've just been busy, I said lamely, knowing it wasn't a great excuse. Julia's smile widened, and she stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. Busy? Huh. Too busy to even talk to me. There was a teasing lilt to her voice, but underneath it I could sense something else, something more serious. She wasn't just playing around. There was something real behind her words, something she wasn't saying out loud. I'm not avoiding you. CLA. I repeated, though. My voice was squeaky. Her now unsure, she took another step closer, her body just a few feet from mine. Now I could feel the tension in the room, growing, thickening the air between us. My pulse quickened and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. I think you are, she said softly, her eyes searching mine. But you don't have to. I blinked, taken aback by her words. The room felt smaller now, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. Julia's presence was overwhelming her proximity, making it hard to think straight. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, though. The words felt hollow. CLA stepped even closer, her face inches from mine. Now I could feel the heat of her body, the warmth radiating off her skin. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. This was my stepsister, someone I had lived with for 2 years. But in this moment, she didn't feel like a sister. She felt like something else entirely. You don't have to pretend. Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. I know you felt it too. I stiffened my breath, catching in my throat as her words sank in. She was right. I had felt it. The tension, the unspoken connection that had been simmering between us for weeks. I had tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it wasn't real. But now that she was standing so close with her eyes locked on mine, there was no denying it anymore. I started, but my voice trailed off, unable to form a coherent thought. Claw's hand moved, then reaching out to gently brush against my arm. The contact was light, barely there, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, making my pulse race even faster. You don't have to say anything, she whispered, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. Just stop pretending. Before I could respond, Claire leaned in, her lips brushing softly against my cheek. The gesture was simple, almost innocent, but it set every nerve in my body on fire. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think, as the reality of what was happening finally hit me. This wasn't just in my head. This wasn't just some unspoken tension that I had imagined. CLA felt it too, and now there was no going back. I stood there frozen as Julia's lips brushed against my cheek. It wasn't a full kiss, more of a tease, a hint of something deeper. But it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin, the subtle pressure of her lips lingering in the air between us. Julia, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to push her away to end this before it went any further. But another part of me, the part I had been trying to ignore, wanted her to stay close, wanted to see where this was going. She didn't move. Instead, she smiled, that same soft, knowing smile that made my heart race. What she asked innocently, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But the tension between us was undeniable now, crackling like static electricity in the air. We can't, I started, but the words felt hollow, empty, like I didn't believe them myself. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was Julia, my stepsister. This was wrong, wasn't it? But then she moved again, stepping even closer, her body brushing lightly against mine. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. the softness of her touch, as she reached up and placed her hand gently on my chest. My breath hitched, and I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. Confusion, excitement, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. Who says we can't? She murmured, her eyes locked on mine. There was a challenge in her gaze, a question that hung in the air between us. I swallowed hard, trying to clear my head, but it was impossible to think straight, with her so close, with her touch sending shockwaves through my entire body. You know why? I said, though my voice was shaky. Unsure, Julia's hand slid down my chest, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path that made my heart race even faster. She asked softly, her lips curving into a playful smile. Because it seems to me like you've been wanting this just as much as I have. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stiffened, my mind reeling. Was she right? Had I wanted this all along? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a surge of guilt rise up inside me. But at the same time, there was something else, something stronger. A part of me had been waiting for this moment, had been craving it, without even realizing it. I started, but once again, my voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. CLA took another step closer. Her body now pressed fully against mine, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart through her chest. Her eyes were intense, filled with a mix of desire and curiosity, and it made it impossible to look away. You don't have to be afraid. She whispered, her hand sliding up to rest on the side of my neck, her thumb brushing lightly against my jaw. You don't have to pretend anymore. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, like the world had tilted off its axis, and I was spinning out of control. Everything about this felt wrong, but at the same time it felt so right, like we had been heading toward this moment for a long time even. If neither of us had been willing to admit it. Julia, I tried again, but my voice faltered. She shook her head, said, silencing me with the softest of touches, her fingers brushing against my lips. It's okay, she said softly, her voice steady. You don't have to say anything. And then, before I could stop her, Julia leaned in, her lips pressing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and electric. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if she was giving me a chance to pull away. But I couldn't. Instead, I found myself kissing her back, my hands instinctively moving to her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me, spreading like wildfire. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, every inch of my skin buzzing with the intensity of the moment. Julia's hands slid up to tangle in my hair, her body pressing against mine in a way that made it hard to breathe. This was real. This was happening, and I didn't want it to stop. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. The world seemed to blur around us, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like nothing else mattered. But the two of us standing there in the kitchen, caught up in something neither of us had seen coming. What just happened? I whispered, my voice shaky, but filled with disbelief. CLA smiled, a soft, almost mischievous smile as she looked up at me. What does it feel like? I swallowed hard, my mind still racing. I didn't know how to answer that. It felt like everything had just shifted. Like the tension that had been simmering between us for weeks had finally boiled over. But it also felt like there was no going back now. No way to undo what had just happened. I don't know, I admitted quietly, my hands still resting on her waist. But we can't do this. Julia's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race all over again. Why not? She asked softly. Why can't we? Her words sent a jolt of confusion and excitement through me, and I felt my stomach twist. This was wrong. It had to be wrong. But the way she was looking at me, the way she had kissed me, it made everything feel so real, so undeniable. I mean, you're my stepsister, I said weakly, though even as I said the words, they felt less like a reason and more like an excuse. Julia raised an eyebrow, her smile returning. So what? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. We're not added by blood. We're just two people. You don't have to let that stop you. Her logic made my mind spin. Technically, she was right. We weren't blood relatives. We were only connected by our parents' marriage. And yet the weight of that fact still hung over me like a dark cloud. But what about them? What about Dad and Louise? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clay's smile faded and she sighed softly, stepping back just enough to create a little space between us. I don't know. She admitted, her voice quiet. But I know that I don't want to pretend like nothing's happening between us anymore. Her words hit me hard, and I felt a surge of emotions rise up inside me. Guilt, confusion, and something deeper. Something I wasn't ready to name. She was right. We couldn't keep pretending the tension between us had been growing for too long. And now that it had finally come to a head, there was no going back. But what were we supposed to do? Now I don't know if we can just ignore this, I said quietly, my mind still spinning. Claire nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at me. We don't have to figure everything out right now, she said gently. We can take it one step at a time. Her words brought a strange sense of calm to the storm that had been raging inside me. She was right. We didn't have to have all the answers right away. We just had to be honest with ourselves and with each other about what was happening. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest start to ease. Okay, I said softly, one step at a time. Julia smiled, a real, genuine smile this time, and the sight of it made my heart swell. We'll figure it out, she said quietly together, and in that moment, believed her. But the story definitely wasn't over yet. The days after that moment in the kitchen pass, in a haze, and the tension between Julia and me only seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't just the memory of the kiss, or the way her touch had set my nerves on fire. It was the fact that we both knew we had crossed a line. We could never uncross, and now everything had changed. We tried to go about our days like normal, like nothing had happened. But it was impossible every time we were in the same room. The air felt charged with something unspoken, something electric. Every glance, every accidental touch, sent my heart racing, and I could see the same intensity in Julia's eyes. It was like a magnet pulling us toward each other, even though we both knew it was dangerous. One evening, about a week after that moment in the kitchen, I found myself sitting on the couch in the living room trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept wandering. I could hear Julia moving around in the kitchen, the sound of plates clinking and cabinets closing as she cleaned up after dinner. My dad and Louise were out again, probably at some dinner party, leaving the house empty. Except for the two of us. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and my thoughts were louder than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about CLA, about the way she had looked at me, the way her lips had felt against mine, and the way her touch had lingered long after she'd pulled away. Every moment alone with her was filled with an undercurrent of tension, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Just as I was about to get up and head to my room, Julia appeared in the doorway of the living room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, her eyes locking onto mine. The look on her face sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my pulse quicken. You okay? She asked, her voice soft but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Yeah, just thinking. Julia walked into the room, tossing the dish towel onto a nearby chair before sitting down on the edge of the couch just a few feet away from me. The air between us crackled with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What about? She asked, her eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer the truth. I had been thinking about us ever since that night in the kitchen, but I didn't know how to say that. Out loud. Didn't know if I was ready to confront the reality of what was happening between us. Just everything, I said. Finally. My voice barely above a whisper. Julia nodded, her gaze still fixed on me. Yeah, me too. For a moment, we just sat there. In silence, the weight of everything that had been left. Unsaid, hanging heavily in the air. I could feel the pull between us, the magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second. And I knew that if I didn't get up and walk away, now things were about to escalate in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I didn't move. Instead, I found myself leaning toward her, drawn by an invisible force that I couldn't fight anymore. CLA didn't pull away. She held my gaze, her eyes softening, and I could see the same desire mirrored in her expression. She wanted this as much as I did. We said we'd take it slow, I murmured, my voice shaky. Julia smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my heart race. We are taking it slow, she said softly. But it doesn't mean we have to ignore what's happening. Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Julia met me halfway, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, just like the first time. But this time there was no hesitation, no guilt, just the two of us. Finally, giving in to the tension that had been building for weeks. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I felt Claw's hand slide up to rest on the back of my neck, pulling me closer. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin buzzing with the intensity of the moment. It was like everything else faded away, and all that mattered was her touch, her warmth, her presence. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. As we tried to catch our breath, the world seemed to blur around us, and for a moment it felt like we were the only two people in the universe. We should probably stop, I said quietly, though I didn't really mean it. My hands were still on her waist, and I didn't want to let go. Julia smiled, her fingers gently brushing the side of my face. Do you really want to stop? I hesitated, my heart racing. I don't know. I just don't want to mess things up. She sighed softly, her forehead still resting against mine. I get it. But maybe we're not messing anything up. Maybe we're just figuring things out. Her words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't help but think she was right. This didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like something that had been building for a long time. Something that was finding its way to the surface. I don't know what we're supposed to do. I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. Claire leaned into, but I know she said, and then at that moment I couldn't hold it anymore, and she noticed, and so she kissed me. It was with passion, and we both let ourselves go. It felt amazing. I didn't realize what was happening. That's how much I was enjoying the moment, and the intimate of what the kiss led to. I guess, because of how excited I was. It was over pretty quick, but she didn't seem to care. It felt like a relief. After a minute she moved, and as she stood up, she said, "We'll figure it out," and then disappeared upstairs on her way to the stairs. I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The days that followed felt like we were living in some sort of suspended reality. Julia and I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Every glance, every touch, every moment alone carried a weight that we both felt, but didn't fully acknowledge. We didn't talk about what had happened between us. But the connection was always there, undeniable and impossible to ignore. I tried to go about my routine as normally as possible, but it felt like everything had changed. I was hyper-aware of Julia's presence in the house, the way her footsteps sounded as she moved around, the way her eyes seemed to follow me whenever we were in the same room. It was as if the air itself had thickened, making every interaction between us feel charged with something unspoken one evening. About a week after that second kiss, we found ourselves alone in the house again. My dad and Louise had gone out for dinner, leaving us with the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every thought, every feeling. I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading, trying to distract myself from the tension that seemed to be building. With every passing second, CLA walked into the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate, and I felt my pulse quicken as she sat down across from me. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the overhead lamp above the table, casting soft shadows across her face. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there, her eyes fixed on me, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said. Finally, her voice quiet but firm. I set the magazine down, my heart racing. I had been dreading this conversation, even though I knew it was inevitable. We couldn't keep pretending like nothing had happened. We couldn't keep ignoring the elephant in the room. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaky. "I guess we do." Julia leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the table in front of her for a moment. She didn't say anything, just stared at me as if trying to figure out how to begin. The silence between us was heavy, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on me. "I don't know what to do," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and vulnerability. "I don't know how we're supposed to act now." I nodded, swallowing hard as I tried to find the right words. Me neither. The truth was, I didn't have any answers. I didn't know what we were supposed to do, how we were supposed to move forward. All I knew was that things between us had changed, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. "Do you regret it?" Julia asked, suddenly her voice barely above a whisper. Her question caught me off guard, and I felt a surge of panic rise up inside me. Did I regret it? The kisses, the moments we had shared, the connection that had been building between us for weeks. My mind raced as I tried to process her question, but the answer was clear, even if I didn't want to admit it. "No," I said quietly, shaking my head. "Don't regret it." Julia's shoulders relaxed slightly, and I could see a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Me neither." She admitted, her voice soft. But I'm scared." I frowned, leaning forward. "Scared of what?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I'm scared of what this means," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what happens if we keep going. I'm scared of what happens if we don't." Her words hit me hard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I knew exactly what she meant because I felt it too. There was a part of me that wanted to keep going to see where this connection between us would lead. But there was also a part of me that was terrified. Terrified of the consequences. Terrified of what it would mean for our family, for my dad, for Louise. I don't know what the right thing is. I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. But I don't want to lose you. Julia looked up at me, her eyes filled with emotion. "You won't," she said softly. "But we have to figure this out." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, we do," for a long moment. We just sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the air. The tension between us was still there, undeniable and electric. But there was also something else now, a sense of understanding, a realization that we couldn't keep going the way we had been. We had to make a decision. Julia stood up, suddenly pushing her chair back and walking over to the window. She stood there for a moment, staring out at the darkening sky. Her arms crossed over her chest. I watched her, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to say, what to do. What if we took a break? She suggested finally, her back still turned to me. A break, I echoed, frowning. Claire turned to face me, her expression serious. Yeah, a break from whatever this is. Give ourselves some time to think, to figure out what we really want. Her words made sense, but they also filled me with a sense of dread. The thought of stepping back, of putting distance between us made my chest tighten. But at the same time, I knew she was right. We couldn't keep going. Like this, caught in the middle of something we didn't fully understand. Maybe that's a good idea, I said quietly, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. Claire nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at me. We don't have to make any decisions right now, she said gently, but we need some space to figure things out. I swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. Yeah, you're right. The room fell into silence again, but this time it felt different. The tension between us had eased slightly, replaced by a sense of clarity, of understanding. We didn't have all the answers, but we had taken the first step toward figuring things out, and that was enough. For now, Julia walked back over to the table, sitting down across from me again. She reached out, taking my hand in hers, and the simple gesture sent a wave of warmth through me. Her touch was familiar, comforting, and in that moment, I realized that, no matter what happened between us, I didn't want to lose her. She was too important to me. We'll figure it out, she said softly, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. One day at a time. I nodded, squeezing her hand gently, one day at a time. And in that moment, I knew she was right. We didn't have to rush into anything. We didn't have to know all the answers right now. We just had to take it one day at a time and let things unfold naturally. As the evening wore on, the tension between us slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Peace we didn't need to talk about what had happened or what would come next. We just needed to be there for each other, to take things slowly, to figure out how we felt. We didn't kiss again that night. We didn't push things further. Instead, we sat together in the quiet of the kitchen, holding hands and talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying each other's company. The weight of our situation was still there, but it didn't feel as overwhelming as it had before. We had taken the first step toward figuring things out, and that was enough as the minutes turned into hours and the house remained quiet around us. I realized something. No matter what happened between CLA and me, no matter what we decided in the days to come, I knew one thing for certain. I had crossed a line that never could be uncrossed, but deep down, it didn't even bother me.